My parents disinherited me and took me out of the will because I'm not their biological daughter. They smiled at first, but when they found out what my aunt left me, their smiles disappeared. Let's start from the beginning. My life changed drastically when I was 14. It was the time when my mother thought it was time to settle down once more. This time with a man whose previous marriage produced a son already 3 years older than me. Carlos was 17. From the beginning, let's just say we didn't get along. Before the tension started building, the ink on their marriage certificate was barely dry. At first, it was the little things, the minor conflicts that arise when strangers learn they're now family and are forced to live together. For example, Carlos expected that I cleaned up his mess in the kitchen. Other times, I'd find my shampoo inexplicably disappearing faster than usual, and then find Carlos with perfectly styled hair as though he'd used my preferred product. It was odd. But it wasn't just Carlos' pranks I took offense to. Fernando, my stepfather, handled everything the same way. It always seemed like I was the problem. Anytime anything went wrong, he assumed my responsibility without even asking. And my mother? She was too busy trying to make this new family dynamic work to notice. She covered for Carlos, and she pretended everything was fine. I could perceive right away the disparity in expected outcomes. My mother and Fernando announced they were expecting a baby about a year into this uncomfortable cohabitation. That's when everything really shifted. Suddenly, everything was about preparing for the newborn. The house needed renovations, and guess whose room was chosen to make the nursery? Exactly mine. I was relocated to a small guest room, barely with enough space for my belongings. It felt like a demotion, clearly indicating my place in this family structure. A few months later, Nathan, my new half-brother, became the center of attention. From the very beginning, he was doted on. Carlos perceived this shift and grew even more entitled. He dropped out of college and moved back home, bringing with him late-night parties and questionable friends that drifted in and out of the house at all hours. Fernando ignored any complaints I made about the noise or the mess, and my mother just looked mournful, as if to say, "What can we do?" It was disruptive. I started spending more time at friends' houses, anywhere I could get some semblance of routine. My escape became education. I made sure I didn't leave for home until I absolutely had to. I joined every group I could and stayed late for extra classes. This was survival, not just teenage rebellion. At home, it was like walking on eggshells, always waiting for the next outburst. It was suffocating. One night, I came back later than usual. When I got home, the house was completely silent. On the fridge, I found a note indicating they'd gone out to dinner without me. A family meal that I hadn't been invited to. That piece of paper hit me harder than I'd anticipated. And of course, when they needed someone to blame for something, I felt invisible. Obviously, I didn't belong there, and it hurt. Shortly after my 18th birthday, everything was about to break. I suspected this was just another way Fernando wanted me out of the house. Though I had a part-time job, despite Fernando's constant warnings that it would hurt my academic performance. One night, I came back to find my room completely trashed. While my mother and Fernando were out, Carlos had thrown a party, and somehow my room suffered the damage. A broken lamp, beer stains on my project documentation, total invasions of my privacy. The next morning at breakfast, I confronted them. Fernando's response was cold and dismissive. "You should have been more responsible with your belongings." My mother simply sighed and muttered something about families needing to stick together and let things go. I could no longer keep letting things slide. Everything I did during those years seemed to be under a microscope, but not in a way that indicated they cared for my well-being. Rather, it felt like they were waiting for me to slip up so they could blame me for something. Carlos, who had become a professional slacker, seemed to get away with everything without any consequences. Though Nathan, my little half-brother, was still a child, his level of pampering made it clear who the favorite was. I remember once when I was working on a science project, really interesting stuff. Doing it at home, however, was next to impossible. I wanted quiet, so I tried carving out a workspace in the corner of the living room, but it felt like I was attempting to create something delicate in the middle of Times Square. Eventually, I'd had enough. Carlos would blast music, Nathan would run around and yell, and Fernando would find ways to complain about how my project took up too much space or was making a mess. After packing it up, I went over to a friend's house whose parents let me set up my work in their quiet living room. For the first time, I could concentrate. That was the moment I understood how unusual my home life had become. My friend told me, "You're always welcome here." It was a simple invitation, but it meant the world to me. To me, home was simply a place I couldn't wait to get out of. A home is supposed to be a haven, not just for money but because every hour spent away made it a little easier to breathe. I started taking more shifts at my job. Of course, Fernando didn't like it. He often spoke about my job as a distraction from school, but I understood the real reason he didn't like it. I wasn't there as much for him to criticize. The idea of moving out started taking shape in my head. As I saved more money, I knew it wouldn't be easy. There was no way my mother and Fernando would handle it well. The more I thought about it, the more it felt like the only way to control something in my life. I was filled with anxiety the day I finally decided to inform them I was moving out. Not far from my university, I'd found a modest but reasonably affordable apartment. And with my part-time job, I had saved enough to cover the first 3 months' rent. It wasn't much, but it was mine. The idea of having my own life, my space, was enough to keep me focused. One evening after dinner, I sat Fernando and my mother down at the kitchen table. My heart pounded. I tried to keep my voice steady as I told them, looking them straight in the eyes, "I'm moving out." The room fell silent, and I felt the tension rise. A simple pin drop would have been audible. The first to respond was Fernando. He laughed, shaking his head as if I had told him the most ridiculous thing he'd ever heard. "You think you're ready to live on your own at your age?" he said, his voice laced with disbelief and a hint of mockery. My mother didn't say anything at first. She just sat there, staring at the table with a stony expression. "I am ready," I replied, trying to project more confidence than I felt. The disagreement began when I said I needed my own space and had enough money saved to manage. Fernando went on a full-blown tirade, throwing accusations everywhere. That I was selfish, ungrateful, and looking for a way to escape my responsibilities at home. "Look at you," he sneered. He even tried to make me feel guilty for leaving Nathan behind, as if that were enough justification for me to stay in a toxic environment. Although her response was quieter, it wasn't any less painful. She didn't argue like Fernando or put up a fight. She simply kept lamenting, saying things like, "Families are supposed to be together, and you'll regret this if you leave." But I knew better. It wasn't about family. This was about control. I stood my ground. It wasn't just about wanting my own space but needing it for my emotional and psychological well-being. I felt like a stranger in a house that was supposed to be mine. I was tired of being held accountable for events that weren't in my control. Tired of trying to fit into a family that had already made it clear I wasn't really a part of it. Over the next few days, I went about my preparations. Every item I packed into a box felt like another step towards liberation. Still, it wasn't easy. The morning I was leaving, my mother came into my room. Though it never materialized, I braced myself for another fight. Instead, she quietly helped me pack. Our exchange was superficial. Nothing more than her asking if I needed more boxes or offering to donate some of the old tableware. We both seemed to be trying to avoid the real issues, if only out of habit. The hardest nights were the ones when the apartment was too empty and quiet. Even the obnoxious noises I used to loathe, Carlos blasting his music, Nathan running through the house, Fernando's constant complaints. I was surprised to find myself missing the noise of home. However, I began to appreciate the silence as the days and weeks went by. I could finally begin to breathe without having to tiptoe around the house or preoccupied by Fernando's mood, or whether Carlos had thrown another party. I could come and go as I pleased, eat when I wanted, sleep without interruptions. For the first time in years, I felt like I was finding who I truly was, outside of the chaos of my family. A new kind of freedom. Life soon found its rhythm. I quickly managed juggling work, school, and maintaining my little apartment. It wasn't glamorous, but it was mine. Now that I wasn't living under their roof, my relationship with my mother and Fernando became more controlled. I kept my distance, though I still saw them occasionally, which made things simpler. Then one night, out of the blue, I received a call from my mother. Her tone was muted, colder than usual. "Fernando's been looking at his will," she added, as if commenting on the weather. "He wants to make sure everything is in order." I said cautiously, not sure where she was going with this. She hesitated, then said, "He's decided to include Carlos and Nathan, but not you." Since he is their biological father, it seems more logical to him. There it was, the blow. Even though I didn't expect much from Fernando, hearing it stated so plainly hit me harder than I anticipated. It was the underlying message, not the money, the reminder that I still lacked family membership even after all these years. I forced myself to respond in a neutral voice. I understand. My mother, perhaps understanding how much it hurt, hurried to clarify. You know, this is just a legal thing. It doesn't affect how we feel about you, right? Even though I didn't believe her, the conversation moved on to other subjects, but the damage was already done. That night, I lay in bed staring at the ceiling. That familiar feeling of not belonging gnawed at me. Over the next few weeks, I replayed the conversation over and over in my mind. Part of me wanted to reach out to Fernando to demand an explanation, or at least let him know how much it had hurt. Yet, another part of me wondered why bother. For so many years, the family hadn't felt like one to me. Why did it matter now? I decided to distance myself even further. I cut down on visits, kept myself busy with school and work, and spent more time with my friends, professors, and colleagues. The people who genuinely made me feel valued. These were the people who loved me for who I was, not for what I could offer them, or because we had shared a residence for a few years. The hurt from Fernando's will, as well as from years of feeling like an outsider, started to recede. It wasn't an overnight transformation. There were still moments of resentment, especially at family gatherings when I'd see Nathan and Carlos getting all the attention. However, I realized certain things were beyond my influence and where I was creating my own family and belonging. A few months later, Fernando recovered from his health scare, and life for them continued as normal. The real test came when I was invited to a family dinner, as a sort of celebration. More out of obligation than anything else, I went. The dinner turned out to be as awkward as I had anticipated. Fernando talked about his rehabilitation, everyone fawned over Nathan's recent academic success, and Carlos bragged about a new job he'd mysteriously landed. I mostly stayed silent. It was brutally clear that I was the odd one out. But this time it hurt less. With my position in the family already compromised, I had found peace in it. It was fine that I was the outsider. The people who cared about me for myself outside of that house weren't motivated by any familial obligation or shared DNA. After dinner, I excused myself early, saying I had to leave. I felt a sense of relief as I drove back to my place. I was okay, truly okay. I dealt with the emotional fallout, faced the reality of my circumstances, and come out the other side stronger and more self-assured. For the first time in years, then life threw another curveball. Just when I thought I'd finally found some calm, life unexpectedly took a turn. Just when I felt like I'd finally found some peace in my daily routine, a lawyer I'd never heard of called me one afternoon. Although his tone was pleasant, and his voice seemed official, there was an almost apologetic quality to it. "Am I speaking with Isabel Rodriguez?" he asked. "Yes, this is she," I replied, confused as to where the conversation was heading. "I'm calling regarding the estate of Maria Gonzalez, your great-aunt," he said, his words deliberate and measured. "She passed away recently, and she has named you the sole beneficiary of her estate." For a moment I was silent. I could barely remember Aunt Maria. She was one of those distant relatives you occasionally hear about but never really get to know. She didn't have any children. I vaguely recalled my father mentioning once that she'd helped raise him, but I hadn't seen her in years, possibly since I was a small child. And now I was suddenly being told she had left me everything. "I'm sorry for your loss," the lawyer commented, breaking the silence. "She was an exceptional woman." As I processed what he was saying, I stammered a thank you. "What did she leave?" I asked, half expecting it to be modest, maybe an old house or some family heirlooms. "Your great-aunt was quite well off financially," he said. "Over the years, she made some rather good investments. The inheritance includes several properties, a substantial stock portfolio, and a trust fund valued at approximately $3 million. My heart stopped. I stood there, gripping the phone, mentally calculating. Why me? We weren't close. In truth, when I was younger I made a few visits, but our bond was never really strong. My head struggled to wrap around it. The lawyer then said, "She left a letter for you. I'll send it along with the rest of the documentation. She explains her decision in more detail." After hanging up, I just stood there, staring at my phone, trying to make sense of it all. Why would Aunt Maria leave me everything? I barely knew her. Was it a mistake? The next 3 days were a whirlwind of meetings with the lawyer, signing papers, and learning exactly what I'd inherited. There were houses, stocks, and personal items along with the money. Still, Aunt Maria's letter was what truly impacted me. In her letter, she said she'd always admired my independence. She said I reminded her of herself at my age, determined, self-reliant, capable of creating a life for myself, something she felt she lacked when she was younger. That's why she wanted to give me the opportunity to use her fortune to do something meaningful. It was overwhelming. Here was a relative I barely knew who had noticed something in me that I hadn't even found in my own family. She valued me. My first action was to buy a small house. Nothing fancy, but it was mine. Thinking of financial stability, I also bought a rental property. I saved and invested the remaining money, seeking advice to make sure I made sound decisions. My life changed overnight. Within a week, I stopped worrying about how to make ends meet and experienced true security and freedom for the first time. I decided to keep my inheritance a secret, knowing it wouldn't be well received, but it soon leaked. My mother was the first to call, feigning concern about how things were going with Fernando. Everyone started asking for money. I was inundated with requests for loans and gifts. I felt overwhelmed, but I realized I deserved to live for myself after years of feeling sidelined. I finally told my mother that the inheritance gave me the opportunity to live for myself, and that I needed to act in my own best interest. My mother's response was to accuse me of being selfish, but I stood my ground. The calls lessened as they saw I wouldn't budge. Even though it was difficult, I knew this inheritance wasn't just money. It was a chance to control my destiny. My relationship with the family grew even more strained, but I realized I'd created a new family with people who loved me for who I am. My younger brother Diego was the only one who attempted to reach out, sending me a letter. I accepted I couldn't change the relationship with the rest of the family, and focused on building a life for myself. Although I felt relief, there were still moments of resentment, especially when I saw Nathan and Carlos hogging the attention at family gatherings. The real shocker came when my mother contacted me again. We met at a cafe where it soon became clear she only wanted to discuss her financial struggles. Finally, she told me that she expected me to give her $1 million, claiming that since the inheritance came from my father's side, it was only fair that I hand over that money. I told her I wouldn't give it to her. The tension escalated, and my mother started spreading rumors about me. After a couple of weeks, I received a letter from a lawyer, telling me my mother was suing me for a part of the inheritance. I called my lawyer, who upon review laughed. The lawyer discovered the letter was fake, an attempt by my mother and Fernando to intimidate me into giving them some of the money. Relieved, I understood that I couldn't keep trying to fix what was never a true relationship. I decided to take a break. After discussing it with some friends, we planned a trip. I needed time to clear my head and think about my future. During the trip, I understood I didn't need their money, validation, or acceptance. The people who truly loved me were my friends and colleagues. I realized the family bond is not measured by blood, but by genuine support. Upon returning, I decided to write letters to every member of my family who had tried to control me. I didn't do it for them, I did it for me. I expressed how their behaviors had hurt me, and how I always wanted to be a part of the family, but they pushed me away. I only received a response from Diego, my younger brother, who wrote me a heartfelt letter saying he missed me, and that we could see each other. It was a start. In the end, the legacy of the inheritance was a lesson. It wasn't just about the money. It was a wake-up call. The real family wasn't the one I'd been raised with, but the people who stood by me when I had nothing else to offer but myself. Now I'm where I should be, surrounded by people who truly love me.